Patrick Netherton Show, 1130 The Tiger. He's Rogers Hampton. I'm Patrick Netherton. We're pleased to be joined now by Louisiana State Representative Cedric Glover, former mayor of Shreveport, and a man who knows a good barbecue joint when he sees one. Normally I'd have him on just to talk about barbecue, but we actually have to talk about things of substance when it comes to sports. Cedric, how are you, sir?
I am well, my friend. How are you doing?
I'm doing very, very well. Very pleased to have you with us. All right, so I'm dumb when it comes to how these parliamentary procedures and legislation and how the people are tacking stuff onto other legislation. Is in as simple terms as you can put it for us. Walk me through how this went from, okay, it seems like sports betting is going to be a done deal, to, okay, this bill is ultimately not going to get through.
Well, I don't think that sports betting was ever a done deal.
Okay.
That was one that was tenuous from the very beginning. Had a considerable amount of opposition from lots of different areas of the state. It is in many ways similar to the overall issue of casino gaming as a whole, and that is that you have some folks who understand it, but for, I guess, the perception of how it positions them with their own constituency, tend to be lukewarm when it comes to actually casting votes in support. Similar to what you saw last year in terms of trying to address the legislation that was going to deal with trying to make the actual riverboat casinos more competitive and more viable. The ability to go on land, but still ended up compromising at the 2,300 gaming spaces and what have you, still not what's necessary in order to be able to effectively facilitate the ability for instance, boats in this market to compete against what is the largest casino in America, just north of Dallas and Windstar.
Right, up in Oklahoma.
And so that similar situation exists in terms of sports gaming. And it also, I think, dovetails into the situation with the fantasy sports gaming as well. I think the challenge that you have for many folks who are supportive of gaming in general, sports gaming in particular, is that they don't necessarily see the significance of fantasy sports in similar fashion to what you see in terms of sports gaming. One of the things I think that's necessary in terms of this region, this market, to be able to make our gaming operations here more competitive is that we need real sports gaming.
Yeah.
We need to be able to have the kind of sports gaming operation at the casinos here in Shreveport that allows us to be effectively competitive with Mississippi and to offer us something that is a similar experience to what people know when they go to Las Vegas.
Yeah.
The issue of daily fantasy sports is one that, as I continue to ask, where are the jobs that come from this industry? It's something that obviously is extremely popular, but and it also represents, from my perspective, disruptive technology, which I think is generally a good thing. But the question is, until we get the issue of sports gaming in general, the kind that would be a complementary feature to what's happening down on our riverfront or what's happening out of Louisiana down, then I think the issue of fantasy sports is one that doesn't hold my interest as much as the sports gaming itself does at this point.
Now, here's to me, the interesting aspect of this is it was put on the ballot and passed in 46 parishes, I think, 42, whatever it was, and
47 actually.
Yeah, 47. So my question is, how do you reconcile? Okay, the people seem to want it, but we're trying to figure out how to get our money out of it or figure out the jobs, as you were talking about. How do you reconcile with, the people want it, but we can't seem to figure out how to make it work?
Well, because you still need essentially the enabling legislation to effectively facilitate those 47 parishes and what they would look to do with fantasy sports. And so that in and of itself ends up being separate legislation. And from a legislative standpoint, for instance, if you're looking at this from the perspective of Senator Danny Martinez, who has an open mind to fantasy sports, but understands the imperative of sports gaming. And his position essentially could boil down to those folks who are advocates of fantasy sports to say that I'm willing to support and vote for your enabling legislation, I need you to be willing to commit to voting with me for actual sports gaming. Can we manage to be able to tie these two issues together to broaden and enlarge the constituency and increase the odds of being able to see effective passage of vote?
Okay, so
while you go and see what Senator Martini did on the last day of the session, and obviously that would be something for folks who are fantasy sports advocates to be highly troubling and concerning and problematic. But when you also look that there were corresponding efforts on the House side that prevented his sports gaming legislation from being able to get fair hearings and fair opportunities for up or down votes, and so you got pretty much of a tit for tat sort of a circumstance.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was trying to get you to walk through here, is because there's so much parliamentary procedure, and you're talking about up and down votes, and there's legislation in the House, there's legislation in the Senate. Everybody's trying to get everything done. Simple terms, it seemed like he put a bill forth that would allow parishes to vote on the actual sports betting. Correct? Is that am I right on that? And then and then everything was sort of added to that later. Is that accurate?
Well, you start the legislative session off with folks who end up with what you call clean or clear bills with a specific legislative intent that usually is very narrow and detailed and seeks the rightful end on a specific issue. And that's what you had in terms of Senator Martini's sports gaming bill. The same as you had with Representative Talbot's enabling legislation for fantasy sports. Even I had a sports gaming bill filed as well, just to have an additional instrument for consideration in the event that we got down to the latter part of the session and needed a vehicle to move in the event that there was a consensus. And so as these various things move through the legislative process, which is at minimum a 4-stage process. If it's a House bill, it starts off in a House committee.
Yeah, committee.
Approval there, it goes to the floor.
Yeah.
Meets approval on the floor, then it goes to the Senate, goes to the Senate committee, and then Senate floor. And so as it moves through that process, it can be altered and amended in committee, on the floor, and on the other side in committee again, as well as on the floor. And so that's what you end up seeing happening, is these various instruments that start off one way end up being changed, altered, amended, or in some instances just simply outright defeated at the committee level or on the floor. And as you go through the balance of the process, through the amendment process, the opportunity becomes available to find other legislative instruments that are dealing with a similar area of law, and you have the ability to be able to effectively amend what may have been a previously defeated or deferred bill onto another legislative instrument in an effort to try and get it through final passage before the legislature adjourns. And so that's what you had, a series of instances of that happening over the last several weeks of the legislature in an effort to try and come up with some consensus number of folks, in which I truly believe the possibility was there, was that, I'm willing to vote and support fantasy sports with the understanding and assurance that it's also going to result in the ability for the Shreveport-Bossier casinos as well as the Louisiana Down racetrack to end up being able to have an effective sports book, because I see how that actually translates into actual bricks, mortar, and jobs here in Northwest Louisiana.
Right. Talking to Louisiana State Representative Cedric Glover, and Cedric, I've got to imagine you have to understand the frustration that those of us on the other side or the outside of it feel when we go to the ballot and say, yeah, we're for fantasy sports gaming. We want that to happen. And likely, like you said, most of the people that are for that are probably for sports betting as well. And then ultimately, none of it comes to fruition. It feels like the will of the people isn't taken into consideration. Do you understand that frustration from us?
Certainly. I have an appreciation for it. I just point out again, understanding in terms of how this process works. From my perspective, for fantasy sports gaming to pass, but actual real sports gaming that could be done as a part of the casino experience here in Shreveport throughout the state of Louisiana, for that not to pass would have been something I think that would have been more tragic than the set of circumstances that we're dealing with right now. Because right now, as I look at it, based on the research that I've done, I don't see jobs in Louisiana that come about as a result of fantasy sports. I do think that obviously it's something that a lot of folks are interested in doing. A lot of people want to see have happen. It has the ability to be able to send a relatively minimal amount of revenue to the state's coffers. But I see us as a state not taking seriously the industry of casino gaming as costing us real potential and opportunity to just simply hold on to what right now is probably somewhere just under about 10,000 actual real jobs in Northwest Louisiana, more so throughout the rest of the state. We just got numbers back for May of this year. This market is down 2.2% over May of 2018. You know, Shreveport-Bossier used to be one of the top 5 gaming markets in the entire country. We're now, I think, somewhere around 15 or 16. And we're losing more and more of that every day. And again, that translates into real bricks, mortar, and people going to work and having jobs within this community. So from my perspective, my greatest disappointment is not that fantasy sports did not pass, but that sports gaming did not pass.
Right. So where do we go from here? From what I understand, it can't be brought up again for a bit. What's moving forward here? Because I think, like you said, I think everyone that's in favor of fantasy sports betting is in favor of regular sports betting. We'd all love to be able to go down to Harrah's or to Horseshoe or any of these places and be able to, I want to bet $100 on LSU -7 in the opener against Texas. We'd like to be able to do that. So how do we get that to happen? Where do we go from here?
Well, now, Patrick, that may be the reality amongst the general population, but it obviously was not the reality amongst the legislature, because apparently you had folks who were willing to see fantasy sports go forward, but not see sports gaming go forward. And you did have some other aspects of this that ended up being introduced into it that made the situation unnecessarily confusing and convoluted as well. In fact, at one point, you had an amendment that was added to, I think, the sports gaming bill that would have allowed sports gaming at any location in the state that had video poker machines. That, to me, was not acceptable or appropriate. And so that was an aspect or angle of it that had to be dealt with. But if you had, I think, a consensus amongst those folks who say, I want to see sports gaming, and I'm certainly willing and have no problem voting for fantasy sports, working cohesively with those folks who were really there and really enthused and really committed to seeing fantasy sports go through, then you would have had the numbers between the House and the Senate to see this pass. And so it would appear is that there is some schism that exists potentially between those folks who are for fantasy sports but don't, in fact, want to see sports gaming available at our casinos and racetracks.
And to me, Cedric, it's that's to me what's the most frustrating aspect of all of this is, you have a vote on one issue, but then it gets dovetailed into another issue that maybe you weren't prepared to talk about or deal with, and that to me I think is the most frustrating aspect of dealing with politics is so much stuff gets added on. You rarely see that quote unquote clean bill that just goes through. I'd imagine for you it's a big frustration as well because you try to get certain legislation passed that you want and that your constituents want, but then folks start adding stuff to it, changing it completely, all that. I've got to imagine that's got to be the real frustration of politics, isn't it?
Well, I think it's just simply a matter of priorities. As I said, I remember 25 years ago, this past April, when the anchor dropped on the Shreveport Road, the Harrah's Casino, and that became the start of what is now, as I said, 6 boats that right now are in this market, some 10,000 people who are directly employed, lots of other companies who do a lot of contracting and vending, lots of folks who come into this market still to this day to support those operations, and that's a big part of this economy right now, and it's one that we need to become more serious about if we don't want to end up dealing with larger, more serious economic repercussions. And so that was my priority. And my focus was I'm willing to cast every vote necessary to move forward fantasy sports. What I'm not understanding is why is it that there may be fantasy sports folks who have a different agenda than moving sports gaming forward.
I mean,
and if that is in fact the case, then that's a problem. Because if you're in Louisiana and you're telling me that you want to pass fantasy sports, which again, you help me identify Where are the jobs? Who are the people who go to work in Louisiana every day right now for FanDuel or any of the other folks right now in terms of Louisiana? Tell me, how does that compare, the revenue that would be generated from fantasy sports, how does that compare to what's being generated right now at the riverboat, at the land-based casino, and at the racetrack? And if we don't recognize that gaming revenue in terms of our state budget, whether we like it or not, has now surpassed oil and gas revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And that, again, you're talking just in this market, 10,000 jobs go around the state. I'm sure those numbers are similar in the Lake Charles market, the New Orleans market, probably a little bit less than Baton Rouge. You know, those are real economic circumstances that we need to become serious about and understand that if we don't begin to alter the course that we're on, we're going to continue to lose more and more. We're going to go from being in the top 5 gaming markets in the country to the top 15, to the top 20, and eventually to a point to where the main source of people who are supporting whatever gaming operations are here are people who live within this local market, which at that point makes gaming a net loss for our region as opposed to the net plus that it represents right now.
Yeah, and the sports betting numbers, the money that's coming in just New Jersey alone is staggering. Now, granted, it's a much larger metropolitan area, but the numbers that they're bringing in are every month are staggering with the sports betting. All right, last thing.
And also understand that adding the sports gaming here would have given us yet another distinguishing feature over what's available in Oklahoma and given us a better chance to be able to more effectively compete and market ourselves against, again, just in the WinStar Casino itself, the single largest casino in all of the world.
Yeah. Final thing, when can this be brought up again? When can some legislation be put in? When can we address this again, and how do we address it?
Absent a special session, which there appears to be no need for the balance of this legislative term, absent a special session, the first session of 2020 is what's called a non-fiscal session. You only can bring up tax-related matters, those things that can levy a new tax or what have you, in odd-numbered years. And so the next opportunity under regular circumstances for this legislation to come back before the Louisiana legislature would be 2021. Again, absent any special session that may be called at some point prior to that.
Cedric, I didn't, obviously you didn't write the rules, I didn't write the rules, but that's just silly. I mean, it really is.
But let me ask you, Patrick, for those of you who are amongst the community of folks out here who are very much into fantasy sports and you want to be able to see this happen, how is it that those forces were not able to effectively align themselves and support sports gaming as well?
It's a good question, and it tells you. I think it tells you. Honestly, when you see it, and again, you've gone over this, but when you see it from our perspective, and we vote for something, and then for whatever reason it doesn't get accomplished, then you lose interest in trying again. You lose interest in saying, well, we're going to go at this again, or maybe we're going to try it differently. That kind of thing. It becomes eventually a diminishing enthusiasm for it. And so for me, I'm like, hey, I'm voting for fantasy sports, and I hope that means that sports betting comes up the next time I get to go cast a vote. And it looked like it almost happened, and then it didn't, and neither one ended up happening, even though we voted for one of them. That, to me, becomes the frustrating aspect of dealing with this. And I get it from your perspective. I certainly understand what you're talking about, trying to tie these things in, because you're right. It doesn't create jobs. It's a small revenue stream on the fantasy sports side, and you would love to have sports betting because, hey, that employs people. That's a big revenue stream. We all want that, and so I think it's frustrating when some of it doesn't happen because it's tied to something else that we didn't necessarily want it to be tied to. That's just our frustration, I think.
Well, and part of what I'm trying to understand is from the political standpoint.
Yeah.
Who are those folks who are for fantasy sports, but against sports gaming?
Yeah.
Because if you are a Louisiana elected official and you're willing to cast a vote in favor of fantasy sports, but you're not in favor of casting a vote for sports gaming, then in my estimation, you're potentially undermining the fiscal interests of this state because you're not going to ever allow the casinos to be in a position to become more competitive by actually adding sports gaming if you get fantasy sports across the finish line and you don't have that block of votes to potentially be able to look to come up with the numbers needed in order to be able to get passes for sports gaming.
Yeah, political party you're with, what your views are, any of that stuff. We've crossed the Rubicon on this, right? We already have casinos. We have gaming all over the state. We're a gambling state. Welcome to it. But so why is this a bridge too far?
Let me ask you this. Why don't we act like that?
That's what I'm saying. Why is this a bridge too far?
Well, I mean,
at this point,
I'll go back to last year's land-based legislation. We passed legislation that allows the casinos to be able to move off the boats onto a land-based facility, but we capped them at 2,300 gaming spaces. Why would we do that?
Yeah, I don't know, and that's the thing. That's what's frustrating is there's a lot of hypocrisy floating around out there, and that's the part that that's what I'm saying. That's where our frustration lies in this, and that's why I wanted to have you on, because I knew you'd be able to clarify a lot of this for us and why all this went down. And you did, and that's why I love having you on, my friend. That's what you're here for.
I don't know if I clarified, but I am going to keep it straight.
Hey, you made it work for me. I owe you a little barbecue, my friend. We'll make that happen soon.
I'm always down for a slice of fatty.
Hey, you know you are. Cedric Glover, appreciate it, man.
Thank you, my friend.
All right, that was Louisiana State Representative Cedric Glover.